We continue our study in the Gospel of Matthew. We are going to turn to chapter 11, and we will be reading from verses 4 to 6. I will be reading from the Revised Standard Translation. Matthew chapter 11, verse 4. And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is he who takes no offense at me." When we read the reports that Jesus gave to John's disciples, we need the right perspective to understand it. Was the report that Jesus gave to John terse? I'm not saying that Jesus sent a multi-page report and multiple copies of that report to John. I am saying that it was probably the case that it was a little more fuller than what the gospel accounts give. We understand that the gospel writers condense materials. You have to understand that. And so there are times when we need to understand that there was a bit more going on than we see. The second thing to note here is that Jesus was not just giving a report, but he was appealing to John the Baptist as a Jew living in the first century. What do I mean? That which Jesus gives John the Baptist to reflect on would be seen by John the Baptist in a certain perspective. That perspective is found in Isaiah chapter 61. Realize that Jesus knew John the Baptist had a background in Jewish faith, Jewish understanding, Jewish scripture, and ultimately Jewish understanding of the coming of the Messiah. So what Jesus could do is say, you know what, folks, this is what's happening. Tell John this. And John, as it were, could turn around and fill in the blanks. In other words, Jesus was not going to tell John what to think and believe. We have Jesus alluding to one passage, and John the Baptist would in turn understand that passage in light of the larger Old Testament teaching of who the Messiah. You see, Jesus was not about just sharing information. He was challenging people to come to points of faith in him. In Acts chapter 17 and verse 10, we have the story of Paul and Silas visiting the Jewish synagogue in Berea. The city is in the area of Macedonia, and today is a part of northern Greece. In this passage, we have a slice from the ministry of Jesus, Paul, I should say, and it is interesting. In Paul's missionary journeys, he would seek to plant a church in a city by first working in the local synagogue. He would use Jewish people. He would use God-fearers. He would use these people as a means to plant the church, convert them to the faith because they had an understanding to work off of. Paul would not go in, as it were, and tell these people what to believe. What Paul did was share by way of Scripture, what we now know as the Old Testament, how the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus was the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and that Jesus' work, ministry, life, and death was foreordained. The church of Berea, as Paul taught and preached in that synagogue, maintained an open mind, and through the study of Scripture, that is, they took what Paul said and went to the Scriptures and said, you know what? He is saying what is true and correct. The church in its history has been guilty of dictating to people in the church what to believe. We are not saying that people are free to pick and choose what they believe about the faith. What we are saying is that the Christian approach is never to force upon people what they must believe. Christian belief and Christian faith are not things we dump on people. We must allow people to reject the faith at the same time we seek to get them to accept that faith. And a word, coercion, is not appropriate in the life of the church, and in part because belief is not just about the empirical, but more so, belief is about the will. If people reject the faith, it has more to say about their sin and rebellion than whether the faith is true. What underlies Jesus' challenge to John and Paul's challenge to the church or to the synagogue at Berea, and must underlie our presentation of the gospel today, is that we must show a respect for others. We must respect the ability of people to think through the issues and respect the need for people to make their own choice and decision. Go back to what Jesus did with John the Baptist. Jesus challenged him because he knew what the truth was. You must understand that we have the truth on our side. We do not need to coerce people because the faith is true. If people reject the faith, it is not because it is illogical or it is false. People reject the faith because it challenges their core values and it challenges their will that is in rebellion to the will of God. So we do not want to use tactics in the life of the church that give people a reason to reject the faith.